Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we descend into the depths beneath Azeroth to tell the complete story of the Nerubians and the kingdom of Azj-Kahet, an ancient civilization born as servants of the old gods who fought for tens of thousands of years to forge their own destiny. The Nerubians are among the oldest intelligent races on Azeroth, their origins stretching back to an age when the world was shrouded in perpetual shadow, when the old gods ruled with unchallenged dominion, when the very concept of freedom was unknown to the creatures that served the masters of the void. Understanding their story requires us to begin at the very beginning, in an era so ancient that even the longest-lived elves would consider it prehistory, when Azeroth was a world of nightmare and the beings we now call the old gods held absolute power over every living thing. Deep beneath the surface of Azeroth, in caverns that have never known the touch of sunlight, there exists a civilization older than most surface dwellers could imagine. The Nerubians have built their kingdoms in the darkness, have developed arts and sciences that the races above have never conceived, have created a society both beautiful and terrible in its complexity. Their story begins not in the depths where they now dwell, but in the age of the Black Empire, when the old gods ruled Azeroth with unchallenged dominion. In that primordial era, before the ordering of the world by the Titans, Azeroth was a realm of nightmare and shadow. The old gods had crashed into the planet like pestilent spores hurled across the cosmos by the Void Lords, their massive forms burrowing deep into the world's flesh, their corruption spreading through the very bones of the earth. They sought the world soul that slumbered at Azeroth's core, that nascent titan whose power they hoped to claim for their dark masters. To serve their purposes, the old gods created servitor races from the organic matter that seeped from their bodies. The Enraki, those faceless ones whose very appearance could shatter mortal minds, served as their generals and priests. These beings were the generals and high priests of the Black Empire, entities of such terrible power that they could command armies with a thought, could twist reality with their will, could drive mortal minds to madness simply by being perceived. The Nraki served as the intermediaries between the old gods and their lesser servants, translating the incomprehensible will of their masters into commands that could be understood and obeyed. And alongside them came the Aqir, insectoid beings designed to form endless hordes of unstoppable military might. These creatures were the soldiers of the Black Empire, countless millions of chitinous warriors that spread across the surface of Azeroth, enforcing the will of their old godmasters. Where the Enraki provided leadership and magical power, the Aqir provided numbers and relentless aggression. They were created to be the perfect soldiers, beings without fear or doubt, without ambition or resentment, knowing only obedience and the drive to destroy whatever their masters commanded them to destroy. The creation of the Aqir represents one of the most significant achievements of the old gods during the age of the Black Empire. These beings were not merely spawned like the mindless organisms that the old gods produced constantly from their massive forms. The Aqir were designed, engineered with specific purposes in mind, their bodies and minds shaped by intelligences that had existed since before the universe took its current form. Every aspect of Aqir biology served a function in the greater machinery of the Black Empire. The Aqir were unlike any other creatures that would later evolve upon Azeroth. They possessed a hive mind mentality, capable of coordinating their actions across vast distances through psychic connections that bound them to the old gods themselves. Their bodies were engineered for war, covered in armor like chitin, equipped with claws and mandibles capable of rending through any defense. They built cities beneath the earth, vast hive complexes where millions of their kind dwelt in perfect service to their creators. The empire they built was called Azj-Aqir, and at its height, it stretched across the entire supercontinent that would later be known as Kalimdor. Their ziggurats and temple cities dotted the landscape, monuments to the glory of the old gods they served. Every Aqir knew its purpose from the moment of its hatching, every individual a perfectly designed cog in a machine of shadow and horror. But the Black Empire was not destined to last forever. The Titans, those great beings of order who traveled the cosmos shaping worlds, eventually turned their attention to Azeroth. They recognized the corruption spreading through the planet, understood the threat that the old gods posed to the world soul, and decided to act. The Titans sent their armies, the Titan Forged, to battle the forces of the Black Empire. The arrival of the Titan Forged marked the beginning of the end for the Aqir's Golden Age. These beings of order were unlike anything the Black Empire had ever faced. The Keepers, those mighty constructs who led the Titan-forged armies, wielded powers that could reshape reality itself. Archaetas commanded the very stone of the earth, raising mountains and collapsing caverns at will. Odin led the armies of the north with strategic brilliance and overwhelming force. Raden channeled the power of lightning and creation, and Tyr, the god of justice and valor, fought at the front lines of every battle, his silver hand striking down the servants of shadow wherever they gathered. The Sethraxi, those massive generals who commanded the Aqir armies, proved to be formidable opponents for the Titan Forged. These creatures were among the most powerful beings the old gods had ever created, walking siege engines of chitin and shadow that could devastate entire battlefields with their presence alone. Battles between the Sethraxi and the Keepers leveled mountains and carved new valleys into the earth, released energies that scarred the land for millennia to come. The wars that followed reshaped the face of Azeroth. The Titan-forged clashed with the servants of the old gods in conflicts that sundered mountain ranges and carved new valleys into the earth. The Aqir fought with the fury of creatures who knew no concept of surrender, who existed only to serve their masters. But the Titan-forged possessed power beyond anything the Aqir could match. Keeper Arcadus used his earth magic to collapse their burrows, forcing them above ground where they could be surrounded and destroyed. Most of the Aqir were annihilated in these wars. Their cities were cast down, their hives collapsed, their seemingly endless numbers reduced to scattered remnants hiding in the darkest corners of the earth. The old gods themselves were imprisoned rather than destroyed, the Titans having learned from their mistake with Y'Sharj that removing an old god completely could wound the world soul itself. But the Aqir, those countless soldiers who had served the Black Empire, were left leaderless and broken. Small pockets of survivors tunneled deep underground, fleeing from the Titan-forged who hunted them, seeking darkness where they might rebuild. The great empire of Azj-Aqir was shattered, its unity broken, its purpose lost. The Aqir would never again be a single unified force. Instead, they would scatter to the corners of Kalimdor, adapting to new environments, evolving into new forms, becoming the ancestors of races that would trouble Azeroth for millennia to come. The fall of the Black Empire was not immediate, but gradual, a slow collapse that took centuries as the Titan Forged systematically dismantled everything the old gods had built. The Aqir survivors watched from their hiding places as their world was remade, as the corruption that had defined their existence was purged from the surface, as the old gods were bound in prisons of stone and magic from which they would never escape. Some of the survivors despaired, their connection to their masters weakened and eventually severed entirely. Others adapted, finding new purposes in a world that no longer had a place for them. The trauma of the Black Empire's fall would echo through Aqir descendants for millennia to come, even as they evolved into new forms, even as they developed new cultures and new identities. The memory of what they had once been lingered in their racial consciousness. Some would seek to reclaim that lost glory, to restore the connection to the old gods that had once defined them. Others would flee from that legacy, rejecting it entirely, building new civilizations based on principles that their ancestors would never have understood. The story of the Nerubians is, in many ways, a story about what happens when a race created for slavery chooses freedom instead. The trolls were the first naturally evolved intelligent race on Azeroth, and they had watched the fall of the Black Empire with a mixture of relief and wariness. They built their own civilizations in the aftermath, establishing great empires across Kalimdor. The Zandalari sat atop the hierarchy of troll society, their magnificent city of Zuldazar rising in the mountains, their priests and mystics communing with the powerful spirits called Loa. For thousands of years after the Black Empire's fall, an uneasy peace existed between the trolls and the remnants of the Aqir that still lurked in the underground places. The trolls knew that the insectoid creatures existed, knew that they had once served terrible masters, but the Aqir showed no interest in returning to the surface. They remained hidden, nursing their hatred, waiting for an opportunity that most believed would never come. Only one place was forbidden by the Zandalari's witch doctors and priests, a small mound of blackened stone at the base of the Zandalar Mountains. The Loa warned the tribe's mystics of severe consequences should they disturb the black stones. The warnings were specific and dire, speaking of ancient horrors that slumbered beneath the earth, of powers that no mortal was meant to awaken. For many generations, none of the trolls dared disobey this command. The taboo was absolute, passed down from parent to child, reinforced by priests who understood that some secrets were better left buried. But curiosity is a powerful force, and among the trolls there was one whose resentment made him willing to break any taboo. Sometimes the greatest catastrophes in history begin not with evil intent, but with wounded pride and the desperate desire for power. Sometimes a single individual, driven by personal grievances, can set in motion events that will reshape the fate of entire civilizations. Such was the case with Zando, our troll whose name would become synonymous with foolishness and disaster. Zando was a Gurubashi witch doctor who had been ousted from his prestigious position by political rivals. He had been respected once, feared even, a practitioner of dark arts who had served his tribe well. but politics had turned against him. Whispers and accusations had undermined his reputation, and eventually he had been cast out, stripped of his position and his honor, cast out from his tribe, burning with hatred for those who had wronged him. He wandered the lands seeking power that might allow him to take revenge. In his travels, he heard whispers, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, promising him everything his bitter heart desired. These whispers came from an ancient entity of the void, one whose consciousness had been bound within a sacrificial dagger since the age of the Black Empire. The blade that spoke to Zando was Xal'atath, a being of terrible cunning and infinite patience. She guided the outcast witch doctor to the forbidden mound of black stones, urging him to investigate what lay beneath. What Zando discovered was not mere rock, but the slumbering form of Kithix, one of the Sithraxi generals who had commanded the Aqir during the height of the Black Empire. Kithix had been wounded by Keeper Tyr in the ancient wars, and had fallen into hibernation rather than true death. The Sithraxi had been one of the most powerful generals of the Black Empire, a being of such size and strength that it had taken one of the mightiest keepers to bring it down. Even in defeat, Kithix had not truly died. Its regenerative abilities, a gift from its old god creators, had preserved its life force even as its body lay dormant. For millennia, the creature had lain in that death-like sleep, its massive form slowly healing, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken it. At Xal'atath's urging, Zando performed blood rituals, sacrificing his followers one by one to feed power into the slumbering monster. The rituals Zando performed were ancient ones, fragments of Black Empire worship that Xal'atath whispered to him in his dreams. Each sacrifice sent a pulse of life energy into Kithix's dormant form, accelerating the healing process that had been proceeding slowly for millennia. The witch doctor did not understand the full implications of what he was doing. He believed that he was binding a powerful servant to his will, that the creature he awakened would be a tool for his revenge. Xal'atath knew better, but she said nothing. The blade had her own plans, and they extended far beyond the petty ambitions of one disgraced troll. When Kithix finally stirred, the ground itself trembled. The Sithraxi general's eyes opened for the first time in countless ages, and immediately it reached out with its mind, searching for the Aqir who had once served its masters. Deep beneath the earth, in colonies scattered across Kalimdor, the Aqir heard their master's call. General had returned. The war could begin anew. Kithix rallied the scattered Aqir, calling them forth from their hidden places to reclaim the surface world. The insectoids emerged from their tunnels in numbers that the trolls had never expected, swarms of chitinous warriors that swept across the land like a living flood. Numerous smaller troll tribes were completely destroyed in the first waves of the assault, their villages overrun before they could even mount a defense. Kithix itself used Xal'atath's power to weaken the trolls, spreading pestilence and dark visions among their ranks, sowing confusion and despair. The blade that Zando had awakened proved to be a weapon of devastating psychological warfare, driving troll warriors mad, turning their dreams into nightmares, breaking their morale before the Aqir armies even arrived. Before long, Kithix's forces were approaching the Zandalar Mountains themselves, threatening the holiest sites of troll civilization. The Zandalari realized that they faced not merely a war, but potential extinction. If the Aqir reached Zuldazar, if they destroyed the great temple city that was the heart of troll culture, then everything the trolls had built would be lost. In this desperate hour, the Zandalari used their influence to forge an unprecedented alliance. The great troll tribes, who had spent generations competing and fighting among themselves, put aside their rivalries to face the common threat. The Gurubashi of the southern jungles, the Amani of the northeastern forests, the Drakari of the frozen north, all answered the Zandalari's call. Together, they formed the Empire of Zul, a coalition dedicated to the destruction of the Aqir. This alliance was unprecedented in troll history. The various tribes had always been fiercely independent, often waging wars against each other over territory, resources, and honor. For them to unite under a single banner, to submit to Zandalari leadership and fight alongside former enemies, demonstrated just how serious the Aqir threat had become. The trolls understood that if they did not stand together, they would fall separately. The Aqir would destroy them one tribe at a time, just as they had destroyed so many smaller groups in the early days of the war. The war that followed lasted for centuries, a brutal conflict that shaped the future of both races. From atop their temple city, the Zandalari commanded and directed the united troll forces, their strategic position giving them a commanding view of enemy movements. The other tribes employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the land to ambush Aqir forces in the jungles and forests, cutting supply lines, assassinating commanders. The trolls also called upon their Loa for aid. These powerful spirits, the wild gods that the trolls worshipped, proved devastatingly effective against the insectoid armies. The Eloa were beings of tremendous power, and their intervention began to turn the tide of the war. Kithix itself was wounded in combat with these divine beings, forced to retreat northeast to recover. The Zandalari sent their most ambitious warriors to pursue the fleeing Sithraxi. The Amani tribe tracked Kithix far into the northeastern woodlands, cutting through endless waves of Aqir guardians who tried to protect their master. In a final, suicidal assault, the entire Amani tribe threw themselves against Kithix and its remaining minions. Only a tiny fraction of the Amani survived that battle, but the Sithraxi finally fell. Atop the site where they had killed Kithix, the trolls established a settlement that would one day grow into the great temple city of Zul-Aman. The defeat of their general broke the Aqir's coordination. Without Kithix to unite them, they fell into disarray, their attacks becoming unfocused and ineffective. The war continued for several more centuries, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The trolls systematically pushed the Aqir back, scouring central Kalimdor of their presence, containing them in the far corners of the continent. The great empire of Azj-Aqir was shattered forever, its unity broken beyond repair. The Aqir split into 3 distinct groups, each fleeing to a different region where they would adapt and evolve into new forms. Those who fled south would become the Chiraji, eventually settling near the Titan facility of Ahan-Kiraj, where they would once again fall under the influence of the old god Sethun. The Chiraji would build their own empire in the deserts of Silithus, would wage their own wars against the night elves, would threaten Azeroth in their own way. But they would never escape their servitude to the old gods. They would remain slaves, their entire civilization dedicated to the worship of Sethun and the eventual freeing of their dark master. Those who traveled to Pandaria would become the Mantid, continuing to serve the dead old god Y'Sharj through its remnants. The Shetses, the Mantid would develop one of the most sophisticated cultures of any Aqir descendants, complete with a complex caste system, ritualized warfare, and a philosophy that celebrated their connection to the old gods rather than fleeing from it. They would guard the prison of Y'Sharj's heart for millennia, waiting for the day when their god might return. A fourth group would flee to an unexpected destination, traveling not across the surface, but downward, deep into the earth, eventually finding their way to the underground caverns beneath a distant island chain that would one day be called Kaz-Algar. These Aqir would establish what would become the kingdom of Azj-Kahet, developing independently from their cousins for millennia. But that story would not fully unfold until much later, and those who fled north into the frozen wastes that would one day be called Northrend would become the Nerubians. Of all the Aqir descendants, the Nerubians would take the most remarkable path, rejecting their old god heritage entirely and building a civilization based on independence and self-reliance. Their story was only beginning, and it would become one of the most fascinating in all of Azeroth's history. The Aqir who fled north traveled farther than any of their kin, crossing vast distances to reach the frozen wastes at the top of the world. The journey was long and treacherous, taking generations as the survivors slowly made their way through hostile territory, always moving, always fleeing from the troll hunters who pursued them. Many died along the way, falling to predators, starvation, or simple exhaustion. But those who survived were the strongest, the most determined, the most adaptable of their kind. These survivors were driven by a fierce will to endure that would come to define their descendants. They would not accept extinction. They would not surrender to the fate that had befallen so many of their kin. They would find a new home and build a new civilization, one that would rival anything they had known during the age of the Black Empire. The harshness of their journey forged them into something new, something harder and more resilient than the Aqir they had once been. By the time they reached the frozen north, the Aqir who had begun the journey were long dead, their descendants having been born along the way, knowing nothing of the Black Empire except stories passed down through generations. These new Aqir had no living memory of the old gods, no direct experience of the hive mind connection that had once bound their ancestors to their masters. They were something new, something that had never existed before, and they would become something greater still. In the northern wastes, the fleeing Aqir discovered a small society of Titan-forged creatures called Tol'vir. These beings had been created by the Keepers to maintain various Titan facilities, and they possessed a knowledge of architecture and magical engineering that the Aqir had never encountered. The Tol'vir were not warriors. They were caretakers and scholars, unprepared for the arrival of a desperate and ruthless race of insectoid conquerors. The Aqir overwhelmed the Tol'vir quickly, absorbing their civilization and adapting their knowledge for their own purposes. The architecture of the Tol'vir, with its distinctive ziggurats and geometric precision, would become the foundation of Nerubian building techniques. The Aqir adopted much of what they conquered, transforming themselves in the process, becoming something new and distinct from the kin they had left behind. The absorption of Tol'vir knowledge was not merely theft or conquest. The Aqir studied what they found analyzed it, improved upon it in ways the original creators had never imagined. They took the building techniques of the Tol'vir and adapted them for their own needs, creating structures that could withstand the pressures of the deep earth, that could provide shelter for millions of inhabitants, that could endure for millennia without maintenance. This ability to learn and adapt would become one of the defining characteristics of the Nerubian race. The magical knowledge of the Tol'vir also found its way into Nerubian traditions. The Tol'vir had been created to maintain Titan facilities, and they possessed understanding of arcane principles that few other beings in the world could match. The Aqir studied these principles eagerly, developing their own magical traditions based on what they learned. Their approach to magic became more analytical, more systematic, focused on understanding fundamental principles rather than simply learning individual spells. Over generations, these northern Aqir evolved and changed. The frozen environment shaped their bodies, making them larger and more robust than their southern cousins. Their chitin grew thicker, better suited to the cold, taking on the darker hues that would become characteristic of their kind. Their limbs became longer and more powerful, adapted for moving through the tunnels they were beginning to carve. Most significantly, their minds developed in new directions, becoming more individualistic, more philosophical, less bound to the hive mind mentality that had defined their ancestors. The loss of the hive mind connection was perhaps the most significant change. During the age of the Black Empire, the Aqir had been linked to each other and to their old godmasters through psychic bonds that allowed for instant communication and coordination. Individual Aqir had little sense of self, little ability to think independently, their minds subsumed into the greater consciousness of the whole. But as that connection faded over generations, as the distance from the old gods grew greater, the northern Aqir began to develop something their ancestors had never possessed: individual identity. This was a profound transformation, one that would have been unthinkable to the Aqir of the Black Empire. Each Nerubian became its own being, with its own thoughts, its own desires, its own sense of self. They could still communicate with each other, could still coordinate their actions, but they did so as individuals rather than as extensions of a single consciousness. This individualism would become the foundation of Nerubian culture, the basis for a society unlike anything their ancestors had ever known. They began to call themselves Nerubians, a name that distinguished them from the Aqir they had once been. The name was more than just a label. It was a declaration of identity, a statement that these beings were no longer the mindless soldiers of the Black Empire, but something new, something different, something that had chosen its own path. Among the first of the true Nerubians was Queen Anub'izek, a figure of tremendous importance in Nerubian history. She had been born during the age of the Black Empire, a unique creature created to lead legions into battle. But Anub'izek was different from other Aqir commanders. She possessed visions, glimpses of possible futures that showed her the fate of her people woven among countless possible paths. What she saw disturbed her deeply. The old gods who had created her people were imprisoned but not destroyed. Their whispers still reached through the stone, still called to their former servants, still promised power to those who would return to their worship. Anub'izek saw futures where her people answered that call, where they became slaves once more, where they were destroyed by the conflicts of forces far greater than themselves. She made a choice that would define Nerubian identity for millennia to come. Anub'izek led her people deep into the earth, far from the surface where the old god's influence was strongest, and declared herself the first queen of the true Nerubians. She rejected the old gods that had shaped her, rejected the slavery that her people had known during the Black Empire, rejected the destiny that the Void Lords had planned for her race. In that moment, she gave her people something they had never possessed before, the right to determine their own future. The declaration was more than words. Anub'izek established laws and customs that would insulate her people from the corrupting influence of the old gods. She forbade the worship of any power, declaring that the Nerubians would rely only on themselves. She created structures of governance that distributed power rather than concentrating it, making it impossible for any single individual to lead the Nerubians back into servitude. She established traditions of skepticism and self-reliance that would persist for millennia. This was a remarkable act of defiance. The Aqir had been created specifically to serve the old gods, their very existence tied to the will of their masters. For Anub'izek to break free from that purpose, to lead her people toward independence, required a strength of will that few beings in the cosmos could match. She was not merely founding a kingdom. She was creating a new race, one that would define itself on its own terms. Under Anub'izek's leadership, the Nerubians built the foundations of what would become the greatest underground civilization Azeroth had ever known. They carved their tunnels ever deeper into the earth, establishing the first temples and colonies of what would one day be called Azjol-Nerub. The queen guided her people with the wisdom of her visions, steering them away from dangers she could perceive and toward opportunities that would strengthen their new civilization. The Nerubians developed a complex caste system during these early years, a social structure that would persist for millennia. At the top were the queens, who alone could produce new Nerubians. Below them were the Spider Lords, massive creatures who served as rulers and generals, the equivalent of nobility in humanoid societies. The viziers formed a scholarly caste, scholars and mages who preserved lore and wielded arcane power. Seers served as priests and counselors, maintaining the community's intellectual traditions. And the weavers did the practical work of society, building, crafting, farming, and creating the goods that sustained Nerubian civilization. The queen caste was unique among Nerubians. Only queens could lay eggs that would hatch into new generations, making them essential to the survival of the race. This gave the queens tremendous power, but also tremendous responsibility. A queen who failed to produce enough offspring would doom her settlement to extinction. A queen who produced too many could strain the resources of her domain. The balance required careful management, a skill that distinguished great queens from merely adequate ones. The Spider Lords were the physical elite of Nerubian society. Larger and stronger than other Nerubians, they served as warriors, commanders, and governors. Their massive forms were impressive to behold, capable of rending through enemies that would defeat a dozen ordinary Nerubians. But the Spider Lords were more than mere brutes. They were expected to be leaders, to possess the wisdom and judgment necessary to command others. A Spider Lord who was merely strong would never rise to prominence. True success required intelligence, charisma, and political skill. The viziers were the intellectual heart of Nerubian civilization. They maintained the great libraries, developed new magical techniques, advised the queens and spider lords on matters of policy, and preserved the history of their people. Without the viziers, Nerubian civilization would lose its accumulated wisdom, would be forced to rediscover knowledge that had already been learned. They were the memory of the race, essential to its long-term survival. Each caste was genetically distinct, the function of each individual predetermined from birth. A Nerubian hatched as a weaver would always be a weaver, would always serve the role that its biology demanded. This rigid structure might seem oppressive to humanoid societies, but to the Nerubians it provided stability and order. Every individual knew its place, knew its purpose, knew exactly what was expected of it. The architecture they developed during these founding years combined the knowledge they had taken from the Tol'vir with their own innovations. Nerubian structures were built in the style of Egyptian and Mesopotamian ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that served as temples, palaces, and administrative centers. But the Nerubians added their own distinctive touches, phosphorescent plants and glittering surfaces to light their tunnels, intricate web-like decorations that displayed their heritage as spider folk, and defensive features that made each structure a fortress. Most significantly, the Nerubians developed a philosophy that set them apart from all other Aqir-descended races. They came to believe that worship was foolish, that the devotion their ancestors had shown to the old gods had brought nothing but suffering and destruction. The Nerubians would worship nothing. They would rely on their own strength, their own intelligence, their own cunning. They became the only Aqir descendants to completely reject their creators, the only ones to achieve true independence from the shadow that had spawned them. This philosophy of atheism and self-reliance became central to Nerubian identity. While other races prayed to gods and spirits for guidance and protection, the Nerubians trusted only in themselves. They did not deny the existence of powerful beings. They simply refused to bow before them. The old gods were real, they knew, but that did not make them worthy of worship. The Titans were powerful, but that did not give them the right to command obedience. The Nerubians would make their own way in the world, without divine assistance and without divine commands. This philosophy also shaped their approach to magic. Nerubian mages did not call upon external powers for their abilities. They studied the arcane as a science, learning to manipulate magical energies through understanding rather than supplication. Their approach to magic was analytical and precise, focused on understanding how things worked rather than asking higher powers for favors. This gave their magical traditions a unique character, practical and powerful, but devoid of the religious overtones that characterized magic use among many other races. The rejection of the old gods was not without cost. Some Nerubians felt the pull of their heritage, heard whispers in the darkness that promised power to those who would return to the old ways. These individuals were watched carefully by their fellows, and those who showed signs of succumbing to the whispers were dealt with harshly. The Nerubians understood that their freedom was fragile, that the corruption which had enslaved their ancestors was always waiting for an opportunity to reclaim them. Eternal vigilance was the price of their independence. The empire of Azjol-Nerub grew slowly but steadily over the millennia that followed. The Nerubians were patient builders, expanding their tunnels one section at a time, ensuring that every new addition was secure before moving on to the next. They were not interested in rapid conquest or aggressive expansion. They wanted to create something that would last, a civilization that would endure for eternity. This patience was one of the defining characteristics of Nerubian culture. Where other races might rush to expand their territories, to claim as much land as quickly as possible, the Nerubians took their time. Each new tunnel was planned carefully, its route chosen to take advantage of natural features, its supports engineered to withstand the pressures of the surrounding rock. Each new settlement was established only after thorough study of the local environment, ensuring that resources would be available to sustain the population. The Nerubians measured their progress in centuries rather than years, in millennia rather than generations. They thought in terms that surface dwellers could barely comprehend, planning projects that would not be completed for hundreds of years, maintaining traditions that stretched back to the founding of their civilization. This long-term perspective gave them an advantage that few other races possessed, the ability to build something truly permanent, something that would outlast the brief lives of individual Nerubians. At its height, Azjol-Nerub occupied nearly half of Northrend's underground space. The empire stretched from beneath the Borean tundra in the southwest to the icy depths beneath Icecrown in the northeast. The seat of the kingdom lay beneath the Dragonblight, a vast complex of temples, libraries, and residential districts that housed millions of Nerubians. The architecture of Azjol-Nerub was magnificent. Great ziggurats rose from the cavern floors, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings depicting Nerubian history and philosophy. The insect motif appeared on every surface, a constant reminder of the Nerubians' heritage. Phosphorescent plants and bioluminescent fungi lit the vast chambers with an eerie glow, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and unsettling to outsiders. The scale of Azjol-Nerub was difficult for surface dwellers to comprehend. The main chambers were large enough to contain entire cities, their ceilings so high that they disappeared into darkness far above. Bridges and walkways connected different levels, creating a three-dimensional city that took full advantage of the underground space. Transportation networks allowed Nerubians to travel quickly between distant parts of the kingdom, tunnels and passages that connected every major settlement. The engineering that made these structures possible was remarkable. The Nerubians had developed techniques for reinforcing stone, for preventing cave-ins, for managing water and airflow in underground spaces. Their silk was a key material in many of these techniques, used for everything from structural reinforcement to decoration to practical tools. Nerubian silk was stronger than any material surface dwellers had ever encountered, capable of supporting tremendous weight while remaining flexible and resilient. But the true glory of Azjol-Nerub was its libraries. The Nerubians accumulated knowledge with a passion that rivaled even the most dedicated humanoid scholars. Their archives contained vast collections of literature, philosophy, and arcane lore, texts that represented millennia of intellectual achievement. Nerubian scholars debated questions of existence and meaning, developed theories of magic that no surface dweller had ever conceived, and recorded the history of their people with meticulous precision. The libraries of Azjol-Nerub were organized according to principles that took centuries to develop. Each text was cataloged, cross-referenced, and preserved using techniques that ensured its survival for millennia. The Nerubians understood that knowledge was their greatest treasure, more valuable than gold or gems, more important than military power or political influence. They treated their libraries with a reverence that other races might reserve for temples or sacred sites. The subjects covered in these libraries ranged across every field of inquiry. There were treatises on arcane theory that explored the fundamental nature of magic, developing frameworks of understanding that surface dwellers would not achieve for thousands of years. There were philosophical works debating the nature of consciousness, the meaning of existence, the proper organization of society. There were histories that recorded every significant event in Nerubian civilization, from the founding of the first colonies to the present day. There were scientific works analyzing the properties of minerals, the behaviors of underground creatures, the flows of water and air through the vast cave systems that the Nerubians called home. The Nerubians were not a warlike people by preference. They possessed formidable military capabilities, of course, but they saw no need for conquest. They had everything they needed beneath the earth, and the surface world held no appeal for them. The few interactions they had with surface races were usually brief and often unpleasant. Occasionally, they would kidnap humans or elves for experimentation, studying the biology of races so different from themselves. But these were rare events, and for the most part, the Nerubians were content to be left alone. Their society was governed by a complex hierarchy of queens, spider lords, and viziers who shared power according to ancient protocols. Each major settlement had its own ruling queen, with the High Queen of Azjol-Nerub serving as the supreme authority over the entire empire. The Spider Lords acted as military commanders and regional governors, while the viziers served as advisors and administrators. The reign of King Anub'arak represents the height of Nerubian power in Northrend. He was a Spider Lord of exceptional ability, a warrior of tremendous skill who had proven himself in countless battles against the dangers that lurked in the deep places of the world. His rise to power had been hard-won, a testament to his abilities as both fighter and leader. Under his leadership, Azjol-Nerub reached its greatest extent, its influence stretching across the entire underground region of the continent. The dangers of the underground were many and varied. The Nerubians shared their realm with creatures that had lurked in the dark places of the world since before the arrival of the old gods, entities that defied easy classification and that posed constant threats to the borders of the kingdom. Anub'arak had earned his reputation fighting these threats, leading armies into the depths to clear new territory for expansion, personally battling monsters that no other Nerubian could face. Anub'arak was not merely a warrior king. He was also a skilled diplomat and administrator who maintained the delicate balance of power between the various Nerubian settlements. He presided over a golden age, a period when Nerubian civilization flourished as it never had before or would again. The great libraries grew with new additions. The architects constructed ever more impressive structures. The scholars made breakthroughs in arcane theory that would have revolutionized magical practice if the Nerubians had been willing to share their knowledge. During this time, the Nerubians were aware of other powers that existed in the world. They knew of the dragons who sometimes flew over Northrend, those ancient creatures who served as guardians of the world. They knew of the trolls who had once nearly destroyed their ancestors, though the Drakari Empire that existed in Northrend posed little threat to an underground civilization. They even knew of the younger races, the humans and elves and dwarves who were slowly spreading across the surface of Azeroth. The Nerubians occasionally made contact with these other powers, though always on their own terms and always with great caution. They traded with some surface dwellers, exchanging their unmatched silk for materials they could not produce underground. They maintained diplomatic channels with certain factions, ensuring that any potential threats could be identified and addressed before they became serious. But these contacts were limited and carefully controlled. The Nerubians had no desire to integrate with the surface world, no interest in forming the kinds of alliances that might entangle them in conflicts that were not their own. This isolationism was a deliberate choice, a policy that had served the Nerubians well for millennia. By remaining apart from the surface world, they had avoided the wars and catastrophes that had devastated other civilizations. They had watched empires rise and fall above them, had seen powerful races brought low by conflicts that seemed pointless from their perspective, and they had congratulated themselves on their wisdom in staying out of such entanglements. But the Nerubians were confident in their isolation. They had survived the fall of the Black Empire. They had survived the Aqir and Troll War. They had survived the sundering that had torn the ancient supercontinent apart, weathering earthquakes that would have destroyed any surface city. Their kingdom was deep, secure, impregnable. What could possibly threaten them in their underground fortress? This confidence would prove to be their undoing. The Nerubians had grown complacent in their strength, secure in the knowledge that no surface power could challenge them in their underground realm. They did not realize that a new threat was arising in the world, a power unlike anything that had existed before, a force that would prove capable of destroying civilizations far more powerful than their own. The answer came in the form of a fallen prince from the kingdom of Lordaeron, a being who had merged his soul with the spirit of a dark orc shaman to become something new and terrible. The Lich King had arrived in Northrend, and with him came the end of everything the Nerubians had built. The Lich King represented a threat unlike any the Nerubians had faced before. Previous enemies, the trolls, the Titan-forged, the various monsters of the underground, had all been mortal in some sense. They could be killed, could be depleted, could be exhausted. The Scourge was different. It was an army that grew stronger with every battle, that turned every enemy casualty into a new soldier, that never tired and never wavered and never stopped. The Nerubians did not immediately understand the nature of this threat. When the first undead appeared in the tunnels beneath Northrend, they seemed like just another underground menace to be cleared away. The Nerubians had dealt with countless threats over the millennia, had developed protocols for handling new dangers, had become complacent in their ability to address any challenge. They did not realize that this time would be different. The Lich King was not a natural phenomenon. He was a weapon created by the Burning Legion as part of their plan to conquer Azeroth. The spirit of the orc shaman Ner'jul had been tortured and twisted by the demon lord Kil'jaeden until nothing remained but hate and the will to destroy. The process had been terrible beyond description. The orc's consciousness shattered and reformed in patterns of pure malevolence. His memories of family and clan replaced with endless rage and the desire to see all living things reduced to ash and bone. This broken spirit was then bound to a suit of armor and a rune blade, creating an entity of tremendous dark power that was sent to Northrend to prepare for the Legion's invasion. The Frozen Throne, as the Lich King's prison tomb was called, was hurled across the cosmos to crash into the glaciers of Icecrown, sending shockwaves through the continent that the Nerubians surely must have felt in their underground halls. But they did not understand what had arrived. They could not have known that within that block of ice sat the being who would bring about the destruction of everything they had built. Ner'zhul's task was to create an army of undead that would sweep across Azeroth, weakening its defenses before the Legion's arrival. To accomplish this, he needed corpses, millions of corpses that he could raise as mindless soldiers. The sparse population of Northrend was insufficient for his purposes, so the Lich King developed the Plague of Undeath, a magical disease that would kill the living and raise them as undead servants. But the plague had limitations. It worked on the mortal races of the surface world, on humans and elves and dwarves and orcs. It did not work on the Nerubians. Their physiology was too different, their bodies too alien to be affected by a plague designed for warm-blooded creatures. When the Lich King's agents attempted to spread the plague in Azjol-Nerub, the Nerubians ruthlessly destroyed any contaminated areas, preventing the disease from taking hold. Even more frustrating for the Lich King was the discovery that his telepathic domination, the power that allowed him to control the minds of undead, did not work on living Nerubians. Their hive mind heritage, the psychic structures that had once bound them to the old gods, made them resistant to external mental influence. The Lich King could not simply command the Nerubians to serve him. He would have to conquer them the hard way. This was an unprecedented problem for the Lich King. Every other race he had encountered had proven vulnerable to his mental domination once they had been killed and raised. The Nerubians represented something entirely outside his experience, a race that could not be simply subverted, but would have to be physically destroyed. This would require actual military conquest, an expenditure of resources and time that the Lich King had not anticipated. King Anub'arak recognized the threat that the Lich King posed. He had watched as the undead armies expanded across Northrend, enslaving the native inhabitants, raising the dead to swell their numbers. He understood that this new power would not be content with the surface world, that eventually it would turn its attention to the underground realm. Rather than wait for that inevitable assault, Anub'arak decided to strike first. The Nerubians launched a campaign of hit-and-run attacks against the Lich King's strongholds. Their knowledge of the underground tunnels allowed them to appear seemingly from nowhere, strike devastating blows, and then disappear before the undead could respond. They destroyed supply lines, assassinated commanders, and collapsed sections of the underground that the Scourge had occupied. For a time, it seemed as though the Nerubians might actually succeed in containing the threat. Anub'arak personally led many of these raids, refusing to command from safety while his warriors risked their lives. He believed that a king who would not fight alongside his soldiers was no king at all. His presence on the battlefield inspired his troops and terrified his enemies. The undead had never faced an opponent like him, a being of tremendous size and strength who could tear through their ranks like a blade through silk. The Nerubians developed specialized tactics for fighting the undead. Fire proved effective against the walking corpses, and Nerubian alchemists developed incendiary compounds that could be deployed against scourge formations. They learned to target the necromancers who animated the dead, understanding that destroying these commanders would cause their undead minions to fall inactive. They discovered that the undead, while fearless, were also predictable, following simple commands that made them vulnerable to ambush. The War of the Spider, as this conflict came to be known, lasted for years. The Nerubians' tactics were effective, their warriors fearless, their commanders brilliant. Anub'arak himself led many of the most dangerous raids, demonstrating the courage that had made him king. The Scourge suffered tremendous losses, far more than the Lich King had anticipated when he first turned his attention to the underground kingdom. The early stages of the war gave the Nerubians hope. They were fighting on their home ground, in tunnels and caverns they had known for millennia. Every passage could be a trap, every intersection an ambush point. The undead, for all their numbers, were predictable and straightforward, lacking the tactical flexibility that the Nerubians possessed. Anub'arak's generals developed strategies specifically designed to exploit these weaknesses, drawing the undead into kill zones where they could be destroyed efficiently. But the Lich King possessed advantages that the Nerubians could not match. He did not need to rest. His armies did not require food or sleep. Every Nerubian that fell in battle could be raised as an undead servant, strengthening the Scourge while weakening Azjol-Nerub. It was a war of attrition that the living could not win against the dead, no matter how brilliant their tactics or how brave their warriors. The mathematics of the war were brutally simple. Every Nerubian who fell in battle became an enemy soldier. Every victory the Nerubians won came at a cost that the Scourge could absorb, while every defeat, however small, permanently weakened the defenders. The Nerubians could not reproduce fast enough to replace their losses, while the Scourge grew stronger with every corpse it claimed. Time was not on the Nerubians' side. As the war dragged on, Anub'arak began to understand the terrible truth. They were not going to win. They could fight brilliantly, could inflict devastating casualties, could hold out for years or even decades. But the end was inevitable. The Scourge was simply too numerous, too relentless, too willing to absorb losses that would have broken any living army. The Nerubians were fighting not for victory, but for time, hoping that something might change, that some miracle might save them. The Lich King also had allies that the Nerubians had not anticipated. The Dreadlords, those demonic manipulators who served the Burning Legion, provided intelligence and magical support. They studied the Nerubians, identified weaknesses in their defenses, and advised the Lich King on how best to exploit them. The combination of undead numbers and demonic cunning proved devastating. The final assault on Azjol-Nerub was a campaign of total destruction. The Lich King committed his full forces, sending wave after wave of undead into the Nerubian tunnels. The Nerubians fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. Their great ziggurats were toppled, their libraries burned, their egg chambers destroyed. The Lich King brought the subterranean temples crashing down upon the Spider Lords' heads, burying alive any Nerubians who had not already fallen to his armies. The destruction of Azjol-Nerub was methodical and thorough. The Lich King understood that the Nerubians could rebuild if given the chance, that their knowledge and resilience could allow them to recover from even devastating losses. So he ensured that there would be nothing left to rebuild from. The great libraries were particular targets, their contents burned and scattered, millennia of accumulated knowledge destroyed in hours. The egg chambers were located and demolished, preventing the birth of new generations. The infrastructure that had supported Nerubian civilization was systematically dismantled. King Anub'arak was among the last to fall. He fought until he was completely overwhelmed, until his guards had all been destroyed, until there was nothing left but him against an endless horde of the dead. And then he too was killed, his massive form finally brought down by the sheer weight of numbers arrayed against him. But death was not the end for Anub'arak. The Lich King's necromantic powers allowed him to raise the Nerubian king as an undead crypt lord, a mockery of everything Anub'arak had once been. The warrior who had defended his people with such courage was now forced to serve the enemy who had destroyed them. The living Nerubians, who saw their king in this undead state, called him the traitor king, unable to understand that Anub'arak had no choice in his servitude. The transformation was complete, yet somehow incomplete. Anub'arak retained his memories, retained his tactical brilliance, retained even some shadow of the personality he had possessed in life, but his will was no longer his own. The Lich King's power bound him as surely as chains, forcing him to serve, forcing him to turn his knowledge of Nerubian defenses against his own people. Some have speculated that this retention of consciousness was intentional, that the Lich King wanted Anub'arak to be aware of what he was doing, wanted him to suffer as he betrayed everything he had once defended. As an undead crypt lord, Anub'arak became one of the Lich King's most powerful servants. The creature that had once led the Nerubians against the Scourge now led the Scourge against any remaining Nerubian resistance. He commanded the undead forces that occupied Azjol-Nerub, transforming the once great kingdom into a nightmare realm of death and corruption. The living Nerubians who survived the war were reduced to scattered bands of refugees, hiding in the deepest tunnels that the Scourge had not yet penetrated. They watched helplessly as their civilization was systematically destroyed, as their libraries were burned, as their temples were converted to undead fortresses. Everything they had built over millennia was being unmade in a matter of years. Anub'arak's service to the Lich King reached its most significant moment during the events of the Third War, when Prince Arthas Menethil, who had claimed the Runeblade Frostmourne and become the Lich King's champion, needed to reach Icecrown to merge with his master. It was Anub'arak who guided him through the dangers of Azjol-Nerub. The Lich King, at this time, was under siege by the forces of the demon lord Illidan Stormrage, who sought to destroy the Frozen Throne on behalf of Kil'jaeden. Arthas needed to reach his master quickly before Illidan's forces could complete their assault. The surface routes were too dangerous, too heavily contested. But Anub'arak knew another way, a path through the underground that would bring Arthas to Icecrown far faster than any surface journey could manage. The journey through the ruined kingdom was treacherous. The undead crypt lord led Arthas through collapsed tunnels and trapped passages, fighting through pockets of living Nerubians who still resisted, navigating dangers that would have destroyed anyone without intimate knowledge of the underground realm. Anub'arak even fought against ancient horrors that dwelt in the deepest levels of the earth, creatures that predated even the Nerubians themselves. The living Nerubians, who encountered Anub'arak during this journey, called him traitor, cursed him for serving the enemy who had destroyed their people. Anub'arak could not respond, could not explain that he had no choice, could not tell them that the warrior who had once been their king was trapped within an undead shell, forced to watch as his body was used against his own people. When Arthas finally reached Icecrown and ascended to the frozen throne, merging with the Lich King to become a single entity of tremendous power, Anub'arak's service continued. The Crypt Lord remained one of the Lich King's most trusted servants, commanding forces throughout Northrend, suppressing any resistance to undead rule. The Lich King adopted Nerubian architecture for his own purposes, recognizing the practical value of their building techniques. The great necropolis Naxxramas, which would become the Scourge's most powerful floating fortress, was built in the Nerubian style, its ziggurats and geometric patterns adapted from the ruins of Azjol-Nerub. Even the Ebb and Hold, the fortress of the Death Knights, incorporated Nerubian design elements. This was perhaps the cruelest irony of the Nerubians' fate. They had spent millennia developing their civilization, had created architecture of stunning beauty and practical genius, and now their techniques were being used to construct monuments to the power that had destroyed them. Every ziggurat that the Scourge built was a reminder of what had been lost, a perversion of Nerubian achievement in service to the undead. The undead, Nerubians, the crypt fiends, and crypt lords that served the Lich King retained much of their living skills, but none of their free will. They built according to their master's commands, designed structures that served the Scourge's purposes, used their knowledge of underground construction to expand the Lich King's domain. In life, they had used these abilities to create one of the greatest civilizations Azeroth had ever known. In death, they used them to serve the enemy who had destroyed that civilization. For the surviving Nerubians, watching their fallen kin serve the Scourge was a torment beyond description. They saw fathers and mothers, siblings and friends transformed into mindless servants of darkness. They watched as the undead Nerubians helped hunt down the living, using their knowledge of the tunnel systems to track survivors, to collapse hiding places, to drive the living ever deeper into the earth. The dead knew all the secrets of the living, and that knowledge made them deadly hunters. But hope was not entirely dead. Some Nerubians had survived the war, had hidden so deep that even the Scourge could not find them. These survivors, calling themselves the Azjol-Anak, dedicated themselves to continuing the fight against the undead. They established hidden bases throughout the ruins of Azjol-Nerub, launching guerrilla attacks against Scourge forces, slowly reclaiming territory that had been lost. The Azjol-Anak employed the same tactics that their ancestors had used at the beginning of the War of the Spider. They struck from unexpected directions, used their knowledge of the tunnel systems to outmaneuver their enemies, and never engaged in direct confrontations they could not win. It was a difficult way to fight, requiring constant vigilance and endless patience, but it was the only option available to them. The Azjol-Nerub also protected something precious, a secret stash of Nerubian eggs, hidden in the deepest chambers that the Scourge had never discovered. These eggs represented the future of the Nerubian race, the hope that one day, when the Scourge was finally defeated, the Nerubians might be able to rebuild their civilization. Years later, when the forces of the Alliance and Horde came to Northrend to challenge the Lich King directly, the Azjol-Nerub found unexpected allies. Heroes from the surface world fought alongside the living Nerubians, entering the dungeons of Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet to battle the undead that occupied them. Together, they fought their way to Anub'arak himself. The alliance with the surface heroes was an uneasy one. The Nerubians had spent millennia avoiding contact with the races above, viewing them with suspicion and sometimes hostility. But circumstances had changed. The enemy they faced was greater than any grudge or old rivalry. If the Lich King was not defeated, there would be no future for anyone, Nerubian or surface dweller alike. The heroes who ventured into the depths of Azjol-Nerub found a realm of wonder and horror. The architecture of the Nerubians remained magnificent, even in ruin, vast chambers and soaring ziggurats that testified to the greatness of what had been lost. But now those chambers were filled with the undead, with creatures that had once been Nerubians, and with darker things that the Scourge had created from their corpses. In the tournament of the Crusade, Anub'arak was finally destroyed, his undead form shattered by the champions who had come to challenge the Lich King. For the Azjol-Nerub, this was a moment of bittersweet victory. Their king was finally freed from his undead servitude, but the warrior they had admired was truly gone forever. Seer Ixit, one of the leaders of the Azjol-Nerub, hoped that with Anub'arak's destruction and the eventual defeat of the Lich King, his people might finally begin to rebuild. The fall of the Lich King at the hands of Tyrian Fordring and the champions of Azeroth ended the immediate threat to the surviving Nerubians. The Scourge did not disappear entirely, but its coordinated assaults ceased. The Azjol-Nerub could finally emerge from hiding, could begin the long process of reclaiming their ancestral home. The task would take generations, perhaps centuries, but the Nerubians had proven before that they were patient builders. The rebuilding of Azjol-Nerub would be the work of many lifetimes. The destruction wrought by the Scourge had been thorough, designed to ensure that the Nerubians could never recover. Libraries had been burned, egg chambers demolished, infrastructure systematically destroyed. The surviving Nerubians would need to recover what knowledge they could, breed new generations from the precious eggs they had protected, and slowly, carefully, reclaim the tunnels that had been their home. The undead that remained in the ruins posed a constant threat. Without the Lich King's guiding will, they were less organized, less purposeful, but they were still dangerous. The Azjol-Nerub would need to clear them out, section by section, securing each area before moving on to the next. It was slow, dangerous work, but the Nerubians had no other choice. Their ancestral home would not simply be abandoned to the walking dead. The psychological scars of the war would take even longer to heal than the physical damage. An entire generation of Nerubians had grown up knowing nothing but conflict, had lost family members to the Scourge, had watched their civilization collapse around them. These Nerubians would need to learn how to live in peace, how to build rather than merely survive, how to hope for a future that seemed impossibly distant. While the Nerubians of Azjol-Nerub were fighting their desperate war against the Scourge, another Nerubian civilization existed far to the south, hidden beneath the continent of Khaz-Algar in the deepest darkness of Azeroth. This was the kingdom of Azj-Kahet, and its story would take a very different path. The existence of Azj-Kahet was unknown to most of the world, a secret kept for millennia by a people who had made isolation their highest virtue. Even other Nerubians, those of Azjol-Nerub who fought and died against the Scourge, knew only that their southern cousins existed, had only fragmentary knowledge of the kingdom that lay beneath the distant islands. The Nerubians of Azj-Kahet preferred it that way. In their view, obscurity was the greatest protection, and knowledge of their existence was a vulnerability they could not afford. The origins of Azj-Kahet are shrouded in mystery. At some point after the Aqir split into their three distinct groups, a colony of Nerubians separated from those who founded Azjol-Nerub and traveled south. They settled in the vast underground caverns beneath Khaz-Algar, establishing a kingdom that would develop largely independent of their northern cousins. The reasons for this separation are no longer remembered with certainty. Perhaps it was a dispute over leadership, a disagreement about policy, or simply the desire to explore new territories. Whatever the cause, a significant group of Nerubians left the main body and journeyed deep into the earth, seeking a home where they could live according to their own values, their own vision of what Nerubian civilization should be. The caverns beneath Khaz-Algar proved to be an ideal location for a new kingdom. They were vast, containing enough space for a civilization to grow and prosper. They were remote, far from the surface world and its dangers. They were rich in resources, with underground rivers, fungal forests, and mineral deposits that could support a large population. The Nerubians who found this place must have felt that they had discovered paradise. Isolated in the deep darkness, far from the surface world and its conflicts, these Nerubians developed their own culture and traditions. They retained many of the fundamental aspects of Nerubian society: the caste system, the architectural style, the philosophical rejection of worship, but they also evolved in distinctive ways. They became more insular, more suspicious of outsiders, more convinced that their way of life was the only path to survival. Queen Neferes ruled Azj-Kahet during the time of the War of the Spider. She had watched from afar as the Lich King's forces swept across Northrend, had received desperate messages from King Anub'arak begging for aid. The king's emissaries pleaded with Neferes to send reinforcements to help their northern cousins resist the undead tide. The forces of Azj-Kahet could make the difference, could perhaps turn the tide of the war. Neferes refused. Her reasoning was cold but pragmatic. The Scourge was clearly a power beyond anything the Nerubians could resist. Sending forces north would only weaken Azj-Kahet without meaningfully changing the outcome of the war. Her people would die alongside their northern cousins, and then there would be no Nerubians left at all. Better to sever all connections with Azjol-Nerub, to seal the tunnels that connected the two kingdoms, and to hope that the Scourge would never find the southern realm. Her decision sealed the fate of Azjol-Nerub. Without reinforcements, Anub'arak's forces were overwhelmed. The northern kingdom fell, its people destroyed or raised as undead. Neferes watched from afar as everything her cousins had built was demolished, and she told herself that she had made the only possible choice, that survival demanded sacrifice. The decision haunted her nonetheless. In the dark hours of the night, in the moments before sleep came, Neferes wondered if she had done the right thing. She had preserved her kingdom, had protected her people, but at what cost? The Nerubians of Azjol-Nerub had been her kin, had shared her blood and her heritage, and she had left them to die. The messengers who had come begging for aid had cursed her name as they departed, had promised that history would remember her betrayal. Perhaps they were right, but Neferes was a queen, and queens could not afford to dwell on regrets. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with its consequences. She had to believe that she had done what was necessary, that any other decision would have led to even greater tragedy. The alternative was to accept that she had condemned her cousins to death for nothing, and that was a truth she could not face. After the fall of Azjol-Nerub, Neferes renamed her domain the Last Kingdom, believing it to be the final true bastion of Nerubian civilization. She instituted policies of even greater isolation, severing contact with the surface world entirely, ensuring that no hint of Azj-Kahet's existence would reach potential enemies. The kingdom turned inward, focused entirely on its own survival. The Nerubians of Azj-Kahet had always been more conservative than their northern cousins, more suspicious of change, more devoted to tradition. Under Neferes's rule, these tendencies intensified. The kingdom became a place of stagnation, where ancient customs were maintained, but little new was created. The great vigor that had once characterized Nerubian civilization seemed to have drained away, replaced by a defensive mentality focused solely on preservation. The capital of Azj-Kahet was the city of Threads, a sprawling metropolis that had been built on top of itself over countless generations. Unlike the carefully planned architecture of Azjol-Nerub, the city of Threads had grown organically, each new layer built atop the decay of what came before. The highest levels were reserved for the wealthy and powerful, those who had the queen's favor. The lowest levels, the oldest parts of the city, were home to the poorest and most desperate Nerubians. The layered structure of the city reflected the stratification of Nerubian society. At the very top were the queen and her court, dwelling in the grandest structures, enjoying the freshest air and the finest goods. Below them were the nobles and merchants, the viziers and the high-ranking weavers who kept the machinery of civilization running. And below them, in ever darker and more cramped quarters, lived the common Nerubians, those who did the work that sustained the kingdom but received little recognition for their efforts. The lowest levels of the city were places of darkness and despair. Here dwelt the forgotten, Nerubians who had fallen so far from favor that they were no longer considered part of society. They survived on scraps and refuse, on whatever fell from the levels above, living in conditions that would have horrified their ancestors. Yet even these wretched creatures clung to life, clung to the hope that someday their fortunes might change, that someday they might climb back to the light. The districts of the city each served specific purposes. The boroughs housed the forgotten, scavengers who lived in filth, surviving on whatever scraps fell from the levels above. The Umbral Bazaar served as a trading hub, though with no connection to the outside world. Trade was limited to goods produced within the kingdom itself. The Skyne was home to the lore keepers, Nerubian scholars who preserved the knowledge of their people, maintaining archives that grew ever dustier as fewer and fewer had reason to consult them. Generations passed in this state of isolated stagnation. The Nerubians of Azj-Kahet survived, but they did not thrive. Their numbers slowly dwindled as resources grew scarcer, as the underground farms produced less, as the silk that was the foundation of their economy became harder to maintain. Queen Neferis watched her kingdom slowly decline and told herself that decline was better than extinction, that survival at any cost was still survival. The decline was visible everywhere for those with eyes to see it. Buildings that had once been maintained with pride now showed signs of neglect, their surfaces cracked and crumbling. The great silk works that had once produced enough material for all the kingdom's needs now struggled to meet basic demands. The population itself was aging, with fewer young Nerubians being born each generation, the kingdom slowly dying of attrition even without external threats. The lore keepers recorded this decline in their ever-growing archives, documenting the slow erosion of everything their ancestors had built. Some of them hoped that their records might one day help future generations avoid the mistakes of the present. Others simply documented out of habit, continuing traditions that had lost their meaning, preserving knowledge that no one would ever use. The libraries of Azj-Kahet became tombs of wisdom, vast repositories of learning that gathered dust while the living struggled to survive. The traditional Nerubians of the City of Threads developed a fatalistic acceptance of their circumstances. They told themselves that this was simply how things were, that the glory days were past and would never return. They focused on small pleasures and small comforts, trying to find meaning in a world that seemed to be slowly winding down. Some spoke of the old prophecies, of promises that one day the Nerubians would rise again, but most dismissed such talk as foolish dreaming. But not everyone in Azj-Kahet was content with mere survival. Princess Anub'arak, daughter of Neferis and heir to the throne, had grown up hearing stories of the Black Empire, of the power that the Aqir had wielded when they served the old gods. She wondered what might have been if her ancestors had not rejected that power, if they had found a way to claim it for themselves without surrendering their independence. Anub'arak was everything her mother was not. Where Neferis was cautious, Anub'arak was bold. Where Neferis counseled patience, Anub'arak demanded action. Where Neferis saw danger in every change, Anub'arak saw opportunity in every crisis. The princess, chafed under her mother's rule, resented the policies of isolation and stagnation that were slowly killing her people. She believed that there had to be a better way, a path that led somewhere other than slow extinction. The princess spent years studying the history of her people, reading the ancient texts that the lore keepers maintained, learning about the power that the Aqir had wielded during the age of the Black Empire. She became fascinated by that power, by the abilities that her ancestors had possessed before they rejected the old gods. The Nerubians of Azj-Kahet had achieved freedom, yes, but what had that freedom cost them? They had traded power for independence, and now they were slowly dying in the darkness, too weak to save themselves, too proud to seek help from others. When Azj-Kahet faced a crisis of poverty and starvation, when it seemed as though the last kingdom might finally be reaching its end, Anub'arak's questions became more urgent. She confronted her mother, demanding to know why they should accept decline when there might be another path. Neferes responded as she always had, insisting that the old ways were the only safe ways, that any deviation risked destruction. Mother and daughter argued, their relationship growing more strained with each passing year. Anub'izek saw Neferes as a coward, a ruler who had chosen a slow death over any chance at a better future. Neferes saw Anub'izek as reckless, a princess who did not understand the dangers that lurked beyond their borders. Neither could convince the other, and the tension between them festered like an untreated wound. Then came Xal'atath. The arrival of the Harbinger would change everything, would set in motion events that would tear Azj-Kahet apart and leave the Nerubian people more divided than they had ever been. Looking back, some would say that the kingdom had been ripe for Xal'atath's influence, that the tensions between tradition and change, between mother and daughter, had created an opportunity that the Harbinger was uniquely positioned to exploit. Others would argue that it could have been prevented, that if Neferes had been willing to compromise, or if Anub'izek had been more patient, the tragedy that followed might have been avoided. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere between these extremes. The Harbinger of the Void had been working toward her goals for millennia, manipulating events across Azeroth to advance the cause of the Shadow. When she turned her attention to Azj-Kahet, she saw an opportunity that was almost too perfect. Here was a civilization descended from servants of the old gods, a people who had rejected their creators, but who still carried the potential for corruption within them. And they were desperate, weakened by isolation and decline, ripe for someone who could offer them hope. Xal'atath approached Queen Neferes first, appearing before the monarch in the depths of the royal palace. She introduced herself as a being of great power, one who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who understood the true nature of the cosmos. She offered Neferes a bargain. In exchange for the Nerubians' loyalty, Xal'atath would provide them with the means to restore their civilization to its former glory. The method she proposed was the black blood of the old gods. This substance, which still seeped from the depths of Azeroth, where the old gods had once been imprisoned, possessed tremendous power. It could be used to transform Nerubians, to make them stronger, more powerful, more capable of surviving in a hostile world. Xal'atath called the process Ascension, and she promised that those who underwent it would become something greater than they had ever been. The black blood was no ordinary substance. It was the very essence of the old gods, the corruption that had been the foundation of the Black Empire. Throughout history, exposure to the black blood had driven mortals mad, had transformed them into twisted servants of the Shadow, had destroyed civilizations and corrupted entire regions of the world. Xal'atath presented it as a gift, as a path to power and salvation. But those who knew the history of the old gods understood what the black blood truly represented: chains disguised as wings, slavery presented as freedom. Neferes listened to the offer, and for a moment she was tempted. The black blood could solve all of Azj-Kahet's problems, could reverse the decline that had plagued her kingdom for generations. Her people could become powerful again, could reclaim the glory that had been lost. All she had to do was accept the gift of the void. But Neferes remembered the stories of the Black Empire, remembered what had happened to her ancestors when they served the old gods. She had spent her entire reign maintaining the independence that Queen Anub'izek had established millennia ago. She would not surrender that independence now, not even to save her kingdom from decline. She refused Xal'atath's offer, ordering the Harbinger to leave Azj-Kahet and never return. What Neferes did not know was that Xal'atath had also approached her daughter. Anub'izek had listened to the same offer, had heard the same promises of power and restoration. But where her mother saw danger, Anub'izek saw opportunity. Here was a way to save her people, to make them great again, to achieve everything that her mother's cautious rule had denied them. The meeting between Anub'izek and Xal'atath took place in the deepest chambers of the royal palace, in a room so far beneath the city that no one else could have overheard what was said. The Harbinger spoke to the princess in honeyed tones, promising her everything she had ever wanted: power to save her people, strength to protect them from any threat, a future that offered more than just slow decline and eventual extinction. Xal'atath understood Anub'izek's desires better than the princess understood them herself. She knew exactly what to say, exactly how to present her offer, exactly which weaknesses to exploit. The Harbinger had been manipulating mortals for millennia, and she recognized in Anub'izek the perfect combination of ambition, resentment, and desperation that made corruption possible. Anub'izek did not refuse. She accepted Xal'atath's bargain, agreeing to serve the Harbinger's purposes in exchange for the power of the black blood. The princess did not fully understand what she was agreeing to, did not comprehend the true nature of the entity she was dealing with. She saw only a path to power, a way to save her kingdom and prove that her mother's caution had been misplaced. In accepting Xal'atath's bargain, Anub'izek made the same mistake that so many others had made throughout history. She believed that she could control the power being offered, that she could take what she wanted without paying the full price. She did not understand that the void never gave without taking, that every gift from the shadow came with strings attached. By the time she realized her error, it would be far too late. The betrayal came without warning. One night, in the royal chambers of Nerub-ar Palace, Anub'izek confronted her mother with a blade in her hand. Words were exchanged, the final arguments of a conflict that had been building for years. Neferes tried to convince her daughter that she was making a terrible mistake, that Xal'atath was manipulating her, that the power being offered came with chains attached. The confrontation was the culmination of decades of tension. Mother and daughter had never understood each other, had never found common ground on the questions that mattered most. Neferes believed that caution and isolation were the only paths to survival. Anub'izek believed that her mother's fear was killing their people as surely as any enemy could. Both were right in their own way, and both were wrong. In those final moments, Neferes saw something in her daughter's eyes that terrified her more than any threat. She saw certainty, the absolute conviction of someone who believed they were doing the right thing. Anub'izek was not acting out of malice or hatred. She genuinely believed that she was saving her people, that the path she had chosen was the only way forward. Anub'izek did not listen. She had made her choice, and she would not be dissuaded. The blade struck, and Queen Neferes fell, her reign ending in blood and treachery. Anub'izek claimed the throne of Azj-Kahet, declaring herself the new queen, promising her people that she would lead them to greatness. Officially, Neferes was declared dead, killed by agents of the Arathi, the human civilization that dwelt in the nearby cavern of Hollowfall. This lie served two purposes. It concealed Ansurek's role in her mother's death, and it provided justification for a war against the Arathi that would unite the Nerubians behind their new queen. The people of Azj-Kahet, who had loved their queen, rallied to avenge her, never knowing that the real killer sat on the throne. But Neferes was not truly dead. Xal'atath had other plans for the former queen. Ansurek's mother was kept alive, imprisoned in the deepest chambers of the City of Threads, where she became the subject of horrible experiments. The black blood was tested on her, refined through trial and error, as Xal'atath and her servants worked to perfect the process of ascension. What emerged from these experiments was a twisted mockery of what Neferes had once been. She was transformed into what the Nerubians called a hulk, a massive, corrupted creature that bore little resemblance to the queen who had ruled for so long. The process was given a name, the First Ascended, though this title was more mockery than honor. Neferes had opposed everything that Xal'atath represented, and now she had been transformed into a living example of the very corruption she had rejected. Under Queen Ansurek's rule, Azj-Kahet was transformed. The black blood flowed freely now, offered to any Nerubian who wished to become something more than what they had been. Those who underwent the ascension process emerged changed, their bodies twisted into more humanoid forms, their power greatly enhanced, their loyalty to Ansurek absolute. The transformation was both physical and mental. The Ascended no longer resembled the spider-like creatures that Nerubians had always been. Their forms became more upright, more humanoid, though still distinctly inhuman. Their chitin changed color and texture. Their eyes took on new qualities. Their very physiology was restructured to accommodate the black blood that now flowed through their bodies. They were stronger, faster, more resilient than ordinary Nerubians, capable of feats that would have been impossible before the transformation. But the changes went deeper than mere physical enhancement. The ascension process altered the minds of those who underwent it, making them more aggressive, more loyal to the source of their power, more willing to serve Xal'atath's purposes. Whether this was an intentional effect or simply a consequence of the black blood's corruption was unclear. What was clear was that the Ascended were no longer entirely themselves, no longer the Nerubians they had been before the transformation. These Ascended Nerubians became the Queen's elite forces, the shock troops of her new military. They were stronger than ordinary Nerubians, more resilient, capable of feats that would have been impossible for their unchanged kin. Ansurek held them up as examples of what her people could become, as proof that she had made the right choice in accepting Xal'atath's bargain. The ascension was presented as a gift, a choice that any Nerubian could make. In practice, the choice was often less free than it appeared. Those who refused to ascend found themselves marginalized, overlooked for positions of importance, denied resources that they needed to survive. The pressure to undergo the transformation grew stronger with each passing month, until many Nerubians felt they had no real choice at all. Some embraced the ascension willingly, eager for the power it offered. Others ascended reluctantly, driven by fear or necessity rather than genuine desire. And some refused entirely, clinging to the traditional ways despite the costs, believing that their ancestors had rejected the old gods for good reason. But not all Nerubians welcomed the ascension. Traditional Nerubians, those who retained their original arachnoid forms, looked upon the ascended with a mixture of suspicion and disgust. The ascended lacked the pheromones that ordinary Nerubians used to communicate and mark territory. They were different in ways that went beyond mere appearance, their very nature altered by the black blood that had transformed them. A social divide emerged between the ascended and the traditional Nerubians. The true Nerubians of the City of Threads considered themselves superior, the legitimate inheritors of their ancestors' legacy. They saw the ascended as abominations, tainted creatures who had surrendered their heritage for power. This contempt ran deep, creating tensions that Anub'izek had to constantly manage. Meanwhile, the war against the Arathi of Hallowfall continued. The Arathi were humans who had somehow established a civilization in the underground cavern. Their society centered around a massive crystal called Beladar that provided light to their realm. They were warriors of faith, devoted to the light, and they had been in conflict with Azj-Kahet for generations. The origins of the Arathi in this underground realm were mysterious, connected to ancient voyages and lost civilizations that had nothing to do with the Nerubians. What mattered to Anub'izek was that they were there, that they were different, and that they could be used. The war against the Arathi became the defining conflict of her reign, a constant struggle that justified everything she did, that united her people against a common enemy, that distracted them from asking uncomfortable questions about their queen's true allegiance. The conflict between Nerubians and Arathi was not new. It stretched back generations, long before Anub'izek's rise to power. But under her rule, the war intensified. The Ascended proved to be devastating combatants, their enhanced abilities giving the Nerubians advantages they had never possessed before. Victories that would have been impossible under Neferes's cautious leadership became routine under Anub'izek's aggressive command. Anub'izek used this war to consolidate her power and justify her actions. Every victory against the Arathi was presented as proof that the ascension was working, that the Nerubians were becoming stronger under her leadership. Every defeat was blamed on those who had not yet accepted the black blood, on traditional Nerubians who clung to outdated ways. Behind the scenes, Xal'atath pursued her own agenda. The black blood was being collected and stored, gathered from the depths of Azeroth, in quantities far beyond what was needed for ascension. What the Harbinger planned to do with this substance was known only to herself, but it clearly served purposes beyond the transformation of Nerubians. The collection operations were extensive and exhausting. Nerubians were sent to the deepest caverns, to places that had not been visited in millennia, to extract the black blood from seeps and pools that bubbled up from the depths of the world. The work was dangerous, and many Nerubians died or went mad during the extraction process. But Anub'izek insisted that the work continue, that Xal'atath's demands be met, that whatever the Harbinger needed should be provided without question. Some among the Nerubians began to wonder what was really happening. The quantities of black blood being collected far exceeded what was needed for ascension. The essence harvesting operations seemed to have no direct benefit for Azj-Kahet, and Xal'atath herself was rarely seen, emerging only to give orders and to collect what the Nerubians had gathered for her. What was she really planning? What purpose did all of this serve? These questions circulated in whispers, never spoken aloud for fear of attracting the wrong kind of attention. The Nerubians were also set to work harvesting something else, the essence of the old world, magical energy that seeped from places where the old gods had once held power. This harvesting served Xal'atath's larger plan, feeding power to an artifact called the Dark Heart that she carried. Each essence the Nerubians collected made the Harbinger stronger, brought her closer to whatever ultimate goal she was pursuing. The Dark Heart was an artifact of tremendous power, a crystallized fragment of something ancient and terrible. Xal'atath had carried it for millennia, had fed it with the power she gathered from across Azeroth, had nurtured it like a mother nurtures a child. The Nerubians did not understand what the Dark Heart truly was, did not realize that they were helping to create something that could reshape the cosmos itself. They were told only that the harvesting was necessary, that Xal'atath's plans required it, that their queen had approved the operations. The work continued month after month, year after year. Anub'izek believed that she was in control, that she had made a bargain that benefited her people. She did not see that she was merely a tool, a means to an end, a stepping stone on Xal'atath's path to whatever final goal the Harbinger pursued. The power the Nerubians had been promised was real, but it came with a price that none of them truly understood. But not everyone in Azj-Kahet was content to serve Xal'atath's purposes. Some Nerubians recognized that their queen had led them into a new form of slavery, that the freedom their ancestors had fought for was being surrendered in exchange for power they did not truly control. These dissidents began to plot, to seek allies, to prepare for the day when they might overthrow Anub'izek and restore their kingdom to its proper path. The descent began quietly, in whispered conversations in dark corners, in meaningful glances exchanged between old friends who had served under the previous queen. No one spoke openly of their concerns. No one dared to voice the doubts that many shared. Anub'izek's spies were everywhere, the Ascended loyal to her alone, and any hint of disloyalty would be met with swift and terrible punishment. But beneath the surface, resistance was building. The turning point came when certain Nerubians learned the truth about what had happened to Queen Neferess. The official story claimed she had been killed by Arathi assassins, but those who had known her, who had served in her court, knew that something was wrong. The circumstances of her death did not add up. The witnesses who could have corroborated the story had mysteriously disappeared, and there were whispers, terrible whispers, about experiments being conducted in the deepest levels of the palace. The resistance began with widow Arachne, a Nerubian who had served Queen Neferess as her royal weaver and closest confidant. In the old days, before Anub'izek's betrayal, Arachne had enjoyed private audiences with the queen, discussing matters of state in a chamber hung with curtains of the finest violet silk. She had believed in Neferess's vision, had supported the queen's policies of isolation and caution. When Anub'izek seized the throne, Arachne fled the court. She did not believe the official story about Arathi assassins. She knew her queen, knew that Neferess would not have been caught unaware by such an attack. Something else had happened, something that the new queen was concealing. Arachne went into hiding, watching from the shadows as Anub'izek transformed Azj-Kahet according to Xal'atath's designs. What she saw convinced her that action was necessary. The ascension process was not merely a gift of power, it was a form of corruption that was slowly destroying everything that made Nerubians who they were. The kingdom that Neferes had protected for so long was being twisted into something dark and terrible, a tool of the void rather than an independent civilization. Arachne began to recruit others who shared her concerns. She approached Anub'izek, a general who had served loyally under Neferes and who had been increasingly marginalized under Anub'izek's rule. The general had witnessed the changes in the kingdom's military, had seen traditional Nerubian warriors replaced by ascended shock troops. He agreed to join Arachne's conspiracy, bringing with him the loyalty of soldiers who still remembered what Azj-Kahet had once been. The third member of their triumvirate was Executor Nizrek, a vizier who had served in the queen's court. Nizrek had access to information that the others did not, had heard whispers about what was really happening in the depths of the palace. He knew about the experiments being conducted on captive Nerubians, knew about the true fate of Queen Neferes. When he shared this knowledge with Arachne and Anub'izek, they understood that their cause was even more urgent than they had realized. Together, these three formed the Severed Threads, a conspiracy aimed at overthrowing Anub'izek and freeing Azj-Kahet from Xal'atath's influence. Each of them took responsibility for a different aspect of the resistance. Arachne, who called herself the Weaver, coordinated intelligence gathering and covert operations. Anub'izek, the general, organized military forces and planned for the eventual assault on the palace. Nizrek, the vizier, handled political manipulation and gathered support among the court. The three leaders complemented each other well. Arachne brought cunning and patience, the ability to wait for the right moment and to see patterns that others missed. Anub'izek brought military experience and the respect of the soldiers who still remembered the old ways. Nizrek brought political acumen and access to the inner workings of the court. Together, they possessed the skills necessary to challenge a queen who seemed to have all the power in the kingdom. They recruited carefully, approaching only those they were certain they could trust. Each new member of the conspiracy was vetted thoroughly, their loyalties tested before they were brought into the inner circle. The cost of failure was too high to risk. A single traitor could destroy everything they were building, could lead to the execution of everyone involved. They moved slowly, building their network one trusted ally at a time. The name Severed Threads carried multiple meanings. It referred to the threads of silk that Nerubians used for everything from construction to communication, threads that Anub'izek had severed from the traditions of the past. It also referred to the conspiracy's goal to sever Azj-Kahet's connection to Xal'atath and the Void, to cut the threads of corruption that were slowly strangling their civilization. The severed threads operated in secret, knowing that discovery would mean death. Anub'izek had spies everywhere, ascended agents who could infiltrate any gathering, who could detect disloyalty through means that ordinary Nerubians could not counter. The conspirators communicated through coded messages, met only in the most secure locations, trusted only those they had known for years. The organization of the severed threads was necessarily decentralized. No single member knew the full extent of the conspiracy, ensuring that if one cell was discovered, the others could continue operating. Messages were passed through multiple intermediaries, each one knowing only the link before and after them in the chain. It was a frustrating way to operate, slow and cumbersome, but it was also the only way to survive. The conspirators gathered support from across Nerubian society. Traditional Nerubians who resented the Ascended joined readily, seeing the resistance as a way to reclaim their kingdom from those they viewed as abominations. Scholars who mourned the loss of knowledge and tradition offered their expertise. Soldiers who had served under Neferes and who remembered better times brought their combat skills. Even some ascended, those who retained enough of their original personality to question what had been done to them, secretly aided the cause. The goal of the severed threads was clear: overthrow Anub'izek and end Xal'atath's influence over Azj-Kahet. But achieving that goal would require more than just good intentions. They would need weapons, intelligence, and most importantly, the combat power to actually defeat the Queen and her ascended armies. For a long time, it seemed as though these resources would forever be beyond their reach. Their efforts received unexpected support when heroes from the surface world arrived in Khaz-Algar. The forces of the Alliance and Horde had come to this underground realm in pursuit of Xal'atath, seeking to stop the Harbinger before she could complete her mysterious plans. These surface dwellers were initially met with hostility by the Nerubians, but some among them proved willing to listen to the severed thread's cause. The arrival of the surface heroes changed everything. For the first time, the severed threads had access to resources and capabilities that could actually challenge Anub'izek's power. The heroes were powerful warriors and mages, experienced in combat against the forces of darkness, motivated by their own need to stop Xal'atath. They had no loyalty to Anub'izek, no reason to support her regime, and every reason to help those who opposed the Harbinger's plans. The alliance between the severed threads and the surface heroes was born of necessity rather than trust. The Nerubians had spent millennia avoiding contact with the surface world, viewing outsiders as threats to be eliminated rather than potential allies. But circumstances had changed. The enemy they faced was greater than any they could defeat alone. If working with surface dwellers was the price of saving their kingdom, then it was a price they were willing to pay. The heroes brought resources that the conspiracy had lacked: combat power, magical expertise, and connections to forces outside Azj-Kahet. With their help, the severed threads were able to accelerate their plans, to gather intelligence that would have taken months through normal means, to strike at targets that would have been impossible to reach on their own. One critical mission took the conspirators into the Grand Splicer's laboratory, where the experiments on captured Nerubians were conducted. Here they discovered the truth about Queen Neferes, saw what had been done to the former monarch, understood the full horror of what Xal'atath had wrought. The first Ascended was still alive, still conscious, still aware of what had been done to her. The conspirators tried to free her, but Xal'atath appeared and seized control of one of their number, turning them against their allies. The laboratory itself was a place of nightmares. Rows of containment vessels held Nerubians in various stages of transformation, their bodies twisted by the black blood, their minds shattered by the process they were undergoing. The Grand Splicer, the Nerubian scientist who oversaw these experiments, had refined the ascension process through countless iterations, each one bringing new insights into how the black blood could be used to reshape Nerubian flesh. The cost of these insights was measured in broken bodies and tortured souls. Seeing what had been done to Neferes was particularly devastating for those who had known the former queen. She had been transformed into something barely recognizable, a massive hulking creature that bore no resemblance to the elegant ruler who had guided Azj-Kahet for so long. Yet somewhere within that twisted form, consciousness remained. Neferes was aware of what had been done to her, aware of how her daughter had betrayed her, aware that she had become a living example of the very corruption she had spent her reign opposing. The conspirators could not save her. The transformation was too complete, the damage too extensive. All they could do was bear witness to what Xal'atath had wrought and resolve even more firmly to destroy the Harbinger's influence over their kingdom. This confrontation revealed a terrifying truth. Xal'atath could seize control of any Nerubian mind, could turn their own people against them with a thought. The Ascended were particularly vulnerable to this control, their transformation having opened pathways that the Harbinger could exploit. The Resistance would need to account for this threat in their plans. The assault on nerub-ar Palace represented the culmination of the Severed Thread's efforts. The conspirators had gathered their forces, had coordinated with the heroes from the surface, had prepared for a direct confrontation with Queen Anub'arak and her ascended armies. Everything they had worked for came down to this moment. The timing had to be perfect. They would have only one chance at this, one opportunity to strike before Anub'arak could consolidate her defenses and call upon all of her forces. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage, and they could not afford to waste it. If they failed, there would be no second attempt. The severed threads would be destroyed, their members executed, and Azj-Kahet would be lost forever to Xal'atath's influence. The night of the assault, the conspirators gathered at their hidden staging area, reviewing their plans one final time. Each knew their role, knew what was expected of them, knew that many of them might not survive the coming battle. They did not flinch from that knowledge. Freedom had always demanded sacrifice, and they were prepared to pay whatever price was necessary. The palace itself was a fortress of Nerubian architecture, its ziggurats rising from the cavern floor, its passages defended by traps and guardians that had protected Nerubian rulers for millennia. Anub'arak had added her own defenses, ascended warriors stationed at every choke point, the black blood itself weaponized into creatures of terrible power. Nerub-ar Palace had been the seat of Nerubian power in Azj-Kahet for countless generations. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of queens, had hosted ceremonies and celebrations, had sheltered the Nerubian people in times of danger. Now those same walls would witness the climactic battle for the kingdom's future, a confrontation that would determine whether the Nerubians would remain free or be enslaved to the void forever. The approach to the palace was treacherous, even without the Ascended. Defenders, ancient traps designed to protect the royal family from assassins and invaders, had been reactivated and enhanced with black blood corruption. Passages that seemed clear could suddenly fill with poisonous gas or collapse under the weight of those who walked through them. The very architecture seemed to fight against the attackers, as if the palace itself had been corrupted by the power Anub'arak wielded. The attackers fought their way through layer after layer of defenses. Ulgrax the Devourer, a monstrous guardian created by Anub'arak's experiments, was among the first obstacles they encountered. This creature had been driven mad by endless hunger, transformed into a ravenous protector that devoured anything that entered its domain. The heroes destroyed it, but not without cost. The blood-bound horror rose from pools of black blood itself, a manifestation of the old god's essence that had been gathering in the depths of the palace. Fighting this creature meant fighting the very corruption that had infected Azj-Kahet, a battle against darkness made manifest. The horror was defeated, but the black blood continued to pulse throughout the palace, a reminder that the corruption ran deeper than any single creature. Sikrin, captain of the Sureki, led the defense of the palace's middle levels. This ascended commander had been one of Anub'arak's earliest converts, transformed early in her reign and fiercely loyal to the queen who had given him power. He fought with the enhanced abilities that Ascension provided, but even he fell before the combined might of the attackers. Each battle took its toll on the assault force. Wounds accumulated, magical reserves depleted, and some of the conspirators fell never to rise again. The price of victory was measured in blood and sacrifice, in the lives of Nerubians who believed so strongly in their cause that they were willing to die for it. The survivors pressed on, honoring their fallen comrades by continuing the fight. The deeper levels of the palace were even more heavily defended than the outer sections. Here, Anub'arak had placed her most powerful servants, her most trusted commanders, the guardians who would protect her if all other defenses failed. Each chamber presented a new challenge, a new battle that had to be won before the attackers could advance further. Deeper into the palace, the attackers encountered Rashanan, Nexus Princess Kaiveza, and Brood Twister Ovinax, each one a powerful servant of Anub'arak's regime. These battles tested the heroes and their Nerubian allies to their limits, but they pressed on, knowing that they could not turn back now. Rashanan was a creature of nightmare, a Nerubian who had been twisted by the black blood into something barely recognizable. The transformation had granted it power beyond anything a normal Nerubian could possess, but it had also stripped away everything that had once made it a person. What remained was a weapon, a tool of destruction that served Anub'arak's will without question or hesitation. Nexus Princess Kaiveza was a different kind of threat. She was one of the highest-ranking Ascended, a Nerubian who had willingly embraced the transformation and risen to a position of power in Anub'arak's new order. She believed in what the Queen was building, saw the Ascension as the salvation of her people rather than their corruption. Fighting her meant confronting the possibility that some of those who had accepted the black blood had done so with the best of intentions. Brood Twister Ovinax oversaw the experiments that produced new Ascended, the procedures that transformed ordinary Nerubians into creatures of power. The Brood Twister had conducted countless such transformations, had refined the process until it was as reliable as any other procedure. Defeating this guardian meant disrupting the very mechanism by which Anub'arak had built her power base. The Silken Court provided one of the most challenging battles of the assault. Scarab Lord Anub'arak and Skynespinner Takazich were Anub'arak's most trusted advisors, Yet these two powerful Nerubians harbored a hatred for each other that ran even deeper than their loyalty to the throne. They fought the attackers together, but they also fought each other, their rivalry making them unpredictable and dangerous. The history between Anub'arak and Takaj was long and bitter. They had been rivals even before Ansurek's rise to power, competing for influence in Neferes's court, undermining each other at every opportunity. When Ansurek became queen, she had kept them both close, using their rivalry to ensure that neither would ever become powerful enough to threaten her. They hated each other more than they hated the attackers, and that hatred made their defense chaotic, but also unpredictable. The battle in the Silken Court was a three-way fight, with the attackers trying to defeat both defenders, while Anub'arak and Tekaji simultaneously tried to defeat each other and the invaders. The chaos of the engagement made it difficult to coordinate attacks, to identify priorities, to maintain any kind of tactical coherence. But eventually, both advisors fell, their bodies lying together in death as they never would have in life. Finally, the attackers reached Queen Ansurek's inner sanctum. The queen had watched their progress through the palace, had seen her defenders fall one by one. She had hoped that her forces would be enough, that the power Xal'atath had given her would prove superior to anything the surface dwellers could bring. That hope was dying now, but Ansurek was not prepared to surrender. The battle against Ansurek was fierce. The queen had undergone ascension herself, her form enhanced by the black blood, her power greater than any other Nerubian in Azj-Kahet. She fought with the desperation of one who knew that defeat meant death, that there would be no mercy for one who had betrayed her own mother, who had sold her people to the void. Ansurek wielded powers that no Nerubian had ever possessed before. The black blood responded to her will, forming weapons and shields, striking at her enemies with tendrils of corrupted essence. She called upon abilities that seemed to defy the natural order, powers that could only have come from her connection to Xal'atath and the Void. The heroes who faced her had battled many powerful enemies in their careers, but few had proven as dangerous as this fallen queen. The battle raged through the queen's sanctum, destroying priceless artifacts and ancient treasures that had been preserved for millennia. Ansurek did not care about the destruction. She had never valued the traditions of her people, had always seen them as chains rather than treasures. If she could not have her kingdom, then no one would. But desperation was not enough. The combined forces of the severed threads and the surface heroes were too many, too powerful. Ansurek was driven back, wounded, her defenses crumbling. Her ascended guards fell around her, and finally she stood alone against enemies she could not defeat. In her final moments, as she lay broken and defeated, Xal'atath appeared before her. The Harbinger had watched the battle from beyond the physical realm, had observed as her pawn was destroyed. Now she came to witness the end, to speak final words to the queen who had served her purposes. Ansurek looked up at her patron, at the being she had trusted to make her kingdom great. She reminded Xal'atath of the promises that had been made, the bargain they had struck. Her people were supposed to become powerful again. They were supposed to reclaim their glory. All of this was supposed to mean something. Xal'atath's response was cold. She had promised nothing, she said. She had offered the Nerubians an opportunity, and they had taken it. What they did with that opportunity was their own affair. Anub'izek had served her purpose, had collected the skelly black blood and essences that Xal'atath needed, had distracted the heroes while the Harbinger pursued her true goals. If the queen expected gratitude or pity, she would receive neither. Anub'izek was merely a means to an end. She always had been, and now that end had come. The queen fell, her body tumbling from the heights of her palace, her reign ending as it had begun, in blood and betrayal. The severed threads had won their victory, but it was bittersweet. Their kingdom had been torn apart by conflict. Their people had been divided between ascended and traditional. And Xal'atath remained at large, pursuing whatever dark purpose had brought her to Azj-Kahet in the first place. The Harbinger had gotten what she wanted from the Nerubians. The black blood had been collected, the essences harvested, the dark heart fed with the power it needed. Anub'izek had been a useful pawn, but she was never the goal. The Nerubians had served their purpose, and now Xal'atath could move on to the next phase of her plans. What those plans were and how they connected to the greater threats facing Azeroth remained to be seen. For the severed threads, victory brought new challenges. They had overthrown a tyrant, but now they had to rebuild a kingdom that had been systematically corrupted over the course of years. The infrastructure of ascension remained in place. The black blood still flowed through the veins of countless Nerubians who had undergone the transformation. The divisions between ascended and traditional were not going to heal simply because the queen who had caused them was dead. The story of the Nerubians does not end with Anub'izek's fall. In the aftermath of the palace assault, the severed threads faced the tremendous task of rebuilding a kingdom that had been shattered by decades of misrule and corruption. The divisions between ascended and traditional Nerubians remained, a wound that would take generations to heal. The damage done by Xal'atath's influence could not be undone overnight, but there was hope. The conspiracy that had overthrown Anub'izek had proven that Nerubians were still capable of acting for themselves, of rejecting the corruption that had been imposed upon them. The ideals that Queen Neferes had championed, the independence and self-determination that had defined Nerubian identity since the days of Anub'izek, still lived in the hearts of those who had resisted. The leadership of the severed threads now faced the daunting task of governing a kingdom they had never expected to rule. Arachne, Anub'izek, and Nizrek had been revolutionaries, not rulers. They had devoted their lives to overthrowing tyranny, not to the mundane work of administration and governance. Now they had to learn new skills, had to become the leaders that their people needed. The question of what to do with the Ascended was particularly difficult. These transformed Nerubians had supported Anub'izek, had served her regime, had helped enforce her rule, but many of them had undergone the transformation unwillingly, had been conscripted rather than volunteers. Others had accepted the black blood, believing they were helping their people, not realizing the true nature of what they were agreeing to. Could these Nerubians be rehabilitated? Could they be accepted back into society? The answers were not clear. Some voices called for harsh justice, demanding that all who had served Anub'izek be punished. Others argued for mercy, recognizing that many had been victims of manipulation rather than willing collaborators. The debate would continue for years, perhaps generations, as the Nerubians tried to find a way to move forward without betraying either justice or compassion. In the north, the survivors of Azjol-Nerub continued their own rebuilding efforts. The defeat of the Lich King had given them hope, had shown them that even the most terrible enemies could be overcome. The hidden caches of eggs that they had protected through the War of the Spider represented the future of their people, new generations who would never know the horrors their parents had endured. The relationship between Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet remained complicated. The southern kingdom had abandoned the north in its hour of greatest need, had watched from afar as their cousins were destroyed by the scourge. That betrayal could not be easily forgiven, even if the Nerubians who had made the decision were long dead. But both kingdoms now faced the challenge of rebuilding, of reclaiming what had been lost, of ensuring that the Nerubian people would survive to see better days. Perhaps in time, shared struggle would heal old wounds. The Nerubians remain one of Azeroth's most fascinating civilizations, a people whose story encompasses the highest achievements of culture and intellect and the deepest depths of tragedy and loss. They are survivors of the Black Empire, descendants of creatures created to serve the old gods, yet they have fought for their independence with a determination that has impressed even their enemies. Their architecture, with its distinctive ziggurats and intricate geometric patterns, has influenced even those who conquered them. The Lich King adopted Nerubian building techniques for his own fortresses, and echoes of their style can be seen in structures across Northrend. Their libraries, though largely destroyed during the War of the Spider, represented millennia of accumulated knowledge that the world will never fully recover. The loss of those libraries represents one of the greatest intellectual tragedies in Azeroth's history. Thousands of years of Nerubian scholarship, original theories about magic and nature, histories that recorded events no other race witnessed, all of it burned or scattered to the winds during the War of the Spider. Some fragments survive, salvaged by the Azjol-Nerub from the ruins, but most of what the Nerubians knew has been lost forever. Scholars who have studied what remains of Nerubian texts have marveled at their sophistication, understanding that the Nerubians had developed insights that surface dwellers might never rediscover. The Nerubian approach to arcane magic deserves particular mention. Unlike most magical traditions, which rely on external sources of power or supplication to higher beings, Nerubian magic is entirely internal. Nerubian mages learn to manipulate arcane energies through pure understanding, channeling power through their own bodies and minds without calling upon any external force. This approach makes Nerubian magic more reliable and consistent than many other traditions, though it requires years of study to master even basic techniques. Their silk remains one of the most remarkable materials on Azeroth. Nerubian silk is stronger than steel while remaining flexible and light. It can be woven into virtually any shape, from clothing to architecture to weapons. The Nerubians have developed countless uses for their silk over the millennia, and many of these techniques remain unknown to other races. The silk itself seems almost alive in the hands of a skilled weaver, responding to their intentions, taking shapes that should be impossible according to normal materials science. Their philosophy, the rejection of worship, and the emphasis on self-reliance, sets them apart from nearly every other race on Azeroth. Where others pray to gods or spirits for aid, the Nerubians depend only on themselves. This philosophy has served them well in times of crisis, giving them the mental resilience to endure losses that would have broken other peoples. The caste system that defines Nerubian society remains one of their most distinctive features. While it may seem rigid and limiting to outsiders, the Nerubians themselves generally accept it as a natural order. Each caste serves essential functions. Each individual knows their place in the greater whole, and the society functions with an efficiency that more chaotic civilizations cannot match. Whether this system will survive the upheavals that have shaken both Nerubian kingdoms remains to be seen. The Nerubians' relationship with the Void remains complex and troubling. They were created by the old gods, shaped by beings of cosmic darkness for purposes of their own. They have rejected that heritage, have fought to free themselves from the shadow's influence, but the potential for corruption always lingers. The events in Azj-Kahet have shown how quickly Nerubians can fall back under the Void's sway when offered the right inducements. The eternal vigilance that Queen Anub'izek counseled remains as necessary today as it was millennia ago. The connection between the Nerubians and the broader events of the World Soul saga remains to be fully explored. Xal'atath's interest in Azj-Kahet was clearly part of a larger plan, one that extends beyond anything the Nerubians themselves could understand. The black blood they collected, the essences they harvested, all of it served purposes that the Harbinger has not fully revealed. The World Soul saga encompasses 3 major chapters: the War Within, Midnight, and the Last Titan. The Nerubians have already played a significant role in the first chapter, their kingdom becoming one of the primary battlegrounds for the conflict against Xal'atath. Whether they will continue to be involved in the subsequent chapters remains to be seen, but given the cosmic nature of the threats facing Azeroth, it seems likely that the Nerubians will have further roles to play. The lessons of the Nerubian experience are relevant to the larger themes of the World Soul saga. The Void Lords, those primordial forces of darkness that created the old gods, continue to threaten the cosmos. Xal'atath serves their purposes, whether knowingly or not, and her manipulation of the Nerubians demonstrates the kinds of tactics that void-aligned forces use against mortal civilizations. The Nerubians' experience offers both warnings and hope. Warnings about how easily corrupted even the most independent peoples can become, and hope that even after corruption takes hold, it can be resisted and overcome. What is certain is that the Nerubians will continue to play a role in Azeroth's future. They have survived too much, overcome too many obstacles, to fade into obscurity now. Whether in the restored halls of Azjol-Nerub or the rebuilt districts of Azj-Kahet, the spider folk of the underground will persist, will adapt, will endure as they always have. As you drift toward sleep, consider the lessons of the Nerubians' story. They teach us that independence must be fought for, that freedom is never given freely by those who wish to control us. They teach us that even the most desperate circumstances can be overcome through courage and determination. And they teach us that the past, no matter how dark, need not determine the future. Consider the remarkable journey of this race from servitude to freedom. They began as nothing more than weapons, biological tools created by cosmic horrors for purposes of destruction. They had no identity of their own, no individual consciousness, no concept of what it might mean to be free. Every aspect of their existence was defined by their masters, shaped by beings who saw them as nothing more than extensions of their will. And yet, over the course of millennia, they became something entirely different. They developed individual identity, learning to think for themselves, to have their own desires and goals. They created art and literature, philosophy and science, building a civilization that rivaled anything on the surface world. They rejected the gods who had created them, refusing to worship any power, choosing instead to rely on their own abilities and their own judgment. This transformation did not happen overnight. It took countless generations, each one building on the work of those who came before. Each step toward independence was hard won, requiring Nerubians to overcome not only external threats, but also the internal pull of their heritage, the whispers of the void that urged them to return to their old ways. The fact that they succeeded, that they maintained their independence for millennia, is a testament to their determination and their wisdom. The founding of their civilization required a complete reimagining of what they could be. The Nerubians were created to be slaves, designed from the very beginning to serve masters who saw them as nothing more than tools. Yet they chose freedom. They chose to define themselves on their own terms, to build their own civilizations, to fight for their right to exist as independent beings. That choice, made millennia ago by Queen Anub'izek and those who followed her, continues to echo through history, inspiring each new generation of Nerubians to resist the forces that would control them. The story of the Nerubians is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and stagnation. Azj-Kahet's decision to cut itself off from the world, to focus solely on survival at the expense of all else, left it vulnerable to Xal'atath's manipulation. A kingdom that refuses to change, that clings to tradition even when tradition is clearly failing, becomes brittle and easily broken. The Nerubians of Azj-Kahet learned this lesson the hard way, but it is a lesson that applies to all peoples, all civilizations, all beings who must navigate the challenges of an ever-changing world. The tunnels beneath Azeroth stretch for thousands of miles, vast networks of passages that connect distant regions in ways that surface dwellers rarely suspect. In these depths, the Nerubians continue their ancient traditions, weaving their silk, maintaining their archives, preserving the knowledge that makes them who they are. The darkness of the underground is their home, and in that darkness, they have found their own kind of light. These tunnels tell stories of their own, each section a testament to Nerubian history. Ancient passages carved during the earliest days of the Exodus still bear the marks of primitive tools, before the Nerubians developed the techniques that would make them master builders. Later sections show the refinement of their craft, smooth walls, and perfect angles that demonstrate the heights of their engineering achievement. And in some places, the tunnels bear the scars of conflict, the damage from the War of the Spider or from Scourge occupation, reminders of all that has been lost. The Nerubian underground is not a lifeless place. Strange fungi grow in the caverns, some luminescent, some providing food for the Nerubian population. Underground rivers flow through channels carved by eons of water, providing sustenance and power. Creatures evolved for the darkness share the depths with the Nerubians, some domesticated, some wild, some dangerous. The ecosystem of the underground is complex and fragile, and the Nerubians have learned to manage it carefully over millennia. The future remains uncertain for the Nerubian people. Both Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet face the long, difficult task of rebuilding what has been lost. The scars left by the Scourge and by Xal'atath's corruption will take generations to heal. Many Nerubians alive today have known nothing but war and struggle, have never experienced the peace and prosperity that their ancestors enjoyed during the Golden Age. For them, the stories of Azjol-Nerub at its height must seem like legends, too good to be true. Yet the Nerubians endure. They have survived the fall of the Black Empire, survived the Aqir and Troll War, survived the War of the Spider, survived the corruption of Azj-Kahet. Each time they have been knocked down, they have risen again, rebuilt what was lost, continued their ancient traditions in the face of seemingly impossible odds. This resilience is perhaps their greatest strength, more valuable than any military, power, or arcane knowledge. This resilience stems from several sources. The Nerubian philosophy of self-reliance gives them a mental toughness that other races often lack. They do not pray for salvation, do not expect divine intervention to save them from their troubles. They know that their survival depends entirely on their own efforts, and this knowledge makes them remarkably effective at coping with adversity. The Nerubian caste system, for all its rigidity, also contributes to their resilience. Each Nerubian knows their role, knows what is expected of them, knows how they fit into the greater whole. In times of crisis, this clarity of purpose prevents the kind of paralysis that can afflict more chaotic societies. The Nerubians can organize quickly, can coordinate their efforts efficiently, can bring their full resources to bear on any challenge. Perhaps most importantly, the Nerubians have a very long perspective on history. They measure time in millennia rather than years, in dynasties rather than generations. They understand that setbacks are temporary, that even the worst disasters can be recovered from if the survivors are patient and determined enough. This perspective allows them to endure hardships that would break races with shorter memories. The cosmic forces that have shaped Nerubian history continue to move across Azeroth. Xal'atath pursues her mysterious goals. The Void Lords scheme in the darkness between realities, and new threats emerge with each passing year. The Nerubians may yet have a role to play in the great conflicts to come, their unique perspective and abilities making them valuable allies or dangerous enemies, depending on which path they choose. As you let sleep take you, remember the Nerubians, remember their struggles and their triumphs, their defeats and their victories. Remember that even in the darkest depths, beneath mountains of stone and seas of shadow, life finds a way. The Nerubians have proven that freedom is worth fighting for, that independence can be maintained even against the most powerful forces in the cosmos, and that a people can forge their own destiny regardless of how they began. The darkness of the underground holds no terror for those who have learned to call it home. The Nerubians have discovered beauty in the depths that surface dwellers can scarcely imagine. The glow of phosphorescent fungus illuminating vast caverns, the shimmer of crystalline formations catching what little light exists, the intricate patterns of their silk weavings stretching across immense spans, all of these create an aesthetic unique to the subterranean world. Their art reflects this aesthetic with forms and colors adapted to the underground environment. Their music uses frequencies and rhythms that surface dwellers might not even recognize as sound. Their poetry speaks of depths and darkness, of the pressure of stone and the silence of the deep, themes that resonate in their souls in ways that outsiders cannot fully understand. The Nerubians have found meaning in their existence, have created purpose where none was given. They were made to be weapons, but they became artists and scholars. They were designed for destruction, but they built one of the greatest civilizations Azeroth has ever known. They were meant to serve, but they chose freedom. This transformation, this complete reimagining of what they could be, is perhaps the most remarkable achievement in their long history. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, let the story of the Nerubians carry you into peaceful dreams. Their tale is one of struggle and survival, of tragedy and triumph, of a people who refused to accept the fate their creators had planned for them. It is a story that reminds us that freedom is worth fighting for, that even the most powerful forces can be resisted, and that every being has the right to determine their own destiny. The deep places of the world are not empty, not silent, not dead. They pulse with life, with history, with the accumulated wisdom of millennia. The Nerubians have made these depths their home, have found beauty in the eternal darkness, have created civilizations that surface dwellers can barely imagine. They are proof that life adapts, that intelligence flourishes, that beings can thrive in environments that seem hostile to everything we understand about existence. Their silk hangs in vast webs across the caverns, catching what little light exists, creating patterns of shadow and shimmer that delight the eye. Their architecture rises in stepped pyramids toward ceilings so high they disappear into darkness, monuments to achievement that rival anything built under the open sky. This is the world of the Nerubians, a world that most surface dwellers will never see, a civilization that exists in parallel with our own, connected yet separate, ancient yet evolving. As you sleep, perhaps you will dream of these depths, of endless tunnels and vast chambers, of a people who found their own path through the darkness and refused to let anyone take it from them. May the rhythm of their weaving, the echoes of their song, the strength of their conviction carry you into peaceful rest. The stories of Azeroth are filled with heroes and villains, with ancient powers and risen threats, with mysteries that span the ages and secrets that have yet to be revealed. The Nerubians are but one thread in this vast tapestry, but their thread is strong, woven with the determination of a people who refused to accept the fate their creators had planned for them. May their example inspire you as you drift into peaceful slumber. Consider, as sleep approaches, what the Nerubians have taught the world. They have shown that origin need not be destiny, that beings created for one purpose can choose another. They have demonstrated that freedom, once won, must be constantly defended against those who would take it away. They have proven that even the smallest light can persist in the deepest darkness, that hope can survive even the most devastating losses. The underground realms where the Nerubians dwell will continue their ancient rhythms long after we have fallen asleep. The silk weavers will continue their work. The scholars will maintain their archives. The warriors will guard the borders. And somewhere in those depths, new generations of Nerubians will be born, inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the dawn of time, custodians of traditions that have survived against impossible odds. The ancient tunnels stretch away into infinite darkness, connecting places that surface dwellers have never mapped, leading to chambers that have never known the touch of sunlight. In these depths, the Nerubians continue their eternal work of building and maintaining, of preserving what has been learned and discovering what remains unknown. Their civilization endures, changed by all that has happened but not broken, wounded but healing, facing an uncertain future with the same determination that has carried them through countless ages. Perhaps one day, the wounds that divide the Nerubian people will heal. Perhaps Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet will find common ground, will work together to rebuild what has been lost. Perhaps the divisions between ascended and traditional will fade, replaced by a new understanding that embraces both change and tradition. The future is not written, and the Nerubians have proven time and again that they are capable of surprising even themselves. The world above continues its endless struggles, its wars and alliances, its triumphs and tragedies. But in the depths, the Nerubians tend to their own concerns, marking time in their own ways, pursuing goals that surface dwellers might never understand. They are a people apart, connected to the wider world, yet fundamentally different from everything else that lives upon Azeroth. Their story is their own, and they will write its next chapters according to their own wisdom. That is the complete story of the Nerubians and Azj-Kahet. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe. We cover all of Warcraft's most fascinating peoples and places right here on World of Sleepcraft.